let's move on a little bit and talk about the dealers specifically. The point you made, and the point that was made to me when I was researching this subject, is that it's all very well stipulating that you will have a European CC and you will have one based in New York, but if you don't compel people to use the European one, there is a chance that, as someone described it to me, it could just become a shell. What would be the implication of compelling them through law or through regulation to join up to a European CCP? And is that perhaps a slightly protectionist approach to it?
Before I answer that directly, I'm going to make a point, which is that the stakes are rising here, because if you look closely at the debate, it's quite clear that the debate is going to broaden. It's not just going to be about clearing of credit default swaps. We're going to have a debate about clearing of other forms of OTC derivative, which actually raises rather different issues. I think the issues in credit default swaps potentially raise some particularly acute issues with the jump to default aspect of the product and the interaction between the pricing of that product and the credit environment more generally. And you've seen credit spreads move around a lot in the credit crunch. Well, who's surprised by that? But I think that illustrates precisely why industry was actually taking the steps quite a long time before this really got onto the regulatory agenda, why industry was taking the steps to try and make clearing happen for CDS, just as it did in interest rate swaps beforehand. So I think what we have here, yes, there's an element of it which is taking the form of potential compulsion, but to a very large extent you're pushing on an open door there.
As I understand it, there were also concerns on the part of some of the dealers, and probably, dare I say, maybe even part of some of the CCPs that felt, look, at this early stage, we're not entirely convinced that we can deliver operationally what you, the Commission, want us to do. Yes, we want to do this thing, but I'm not sure that we can do it within the timescales that you've set for us.
There may have been an element of that, although I think it was actually quite a fine line. I mean, It wasn't that long in the scheme of things, in the grand scale of things. It wasn't that long after the what was portrayed as a refusal to sign a commitment turned into a very concrete black and white commitment.
And John, can you give me a sense of how much control you think your members would want over your operation? Could you also give me a sense of the dialogue you've been having with the dealers?
I think one area where we believe we're very strong is the buy side, actually. So many of our OTC services are used, and their adoption, their success has been pushed by the buy side. And we certainly think a lot of the features of our service in terms of segregated accounts, multilateral netting, other things which are particularly important to the buy side are stronger in our service than some of the other services. That's our claim. So we think certainly with buy side interest, the dealer community will look to clear in a place where the buy side wants deals to be cleared. But I think there's some of the other clearing providers are looking at more purely inter-dealer solutions, which is perfectly legitimate. And speaking to the argument about one or more clearers, I think there's certainly room for more than one clearer serving different parts of the market.
Richard, do you think there's room for all the participants who are contending for the industry?
I think time will tell. I think that what you've seen in existing clearing models has been more of a gravitation to a single solution. I think there's good reasons why that would happen. You wouldn't rule it out. We're heading into an environment where very clearly there is more appetite to have more business centrally cleared. The question of where the greatest impetus for that comes, I think, is becoming clearer. It's certainly been apparent that, at the very least, the initial regulatory focus was more on the potential for interbank knock-on effects. Look at the concerns around the near collapse of Bear Stearns and the actual collapse of Lehman Brothers. It was very clearly what would happen to interbank counterparties, and if you look at the continuing debate over AIG, it's about what that may do to counterparties, particularly in the interbank sector. So I think that all leads you to conclude that a lot of the focus will remain on that element of the system. And of course, because of the nature, because of the way that the OTC market works, you do see a large flow of volume through those market makers. Doesn't mean that's where most of the risk ends up, not the position, not the directional risk, but it does mean that there's elements of counterparty risk. But then that's precisely why you have a netting agreement in place which is multi-product and which nets down not just within the credit derivative asset class but across all forms of OTC derivative, and that's how you get to that 80% figure that I was referring to earlier. So I think we'll see what the market does about how many providers there are out there, but I think that there's not been a strong presumption on the regulatory side that there has to be a set number of providers out there. I think there's some bias in favour of more competition, but as we've discussed, that does raise issues of its own.